So, a very hot topic right now is the issue of cover cropping, no-till operations. Now, cover cropping, which is growing an extra crop, killing it, planting your crop in there, that's very well known for being a soil building practice and also being a really helpful tool with weed suppression. However, there's also some benefits when it comes to biocontrol. And on top of that, some of the crops that are used in these systems could also be really good insectary plants. So plants that support insect communities on your farm, in your garden. And I know people are very interested in maintaining pollinator communities as well as the natural enemies that provide us biocontrol and help control our pests. So I have been talking a lot with a few experts in this area, including Veronica Yurchak, and I had a little conversation, which I'm sharing with you today. She shared with me some photos from a presentation she gave to her growers recently down in Maryland. I'm going to be putting those throughout here. I'm also providing a link to one of her talks for greenhouse growers specifically, as well as a talk from her colleague presenting the cover cropping that's used commonly in Maryland. So check it out.
So I am Veronica Yurchak. I am an extension specialist for commercial vegetable production with University of Maryland Extension. And a lot of my work focuses on trying to kind of improve pest control in vegetables and create in kind of a more sustainable and economically friendly way. So I do a lot of IPM, which involves a lot of companion planting research.
Well, how do you define a companion plant?
So, a companion plant is essentially any crop or non-crop plant other than the cash crop that you're trying to grow that you plant in close proximity to your cash crop. So, that might be interplanting within the same field or a border planting around the field. It could be hedgerow plantings if they're close enough, but any kind of alternative planting within close proximity to the main crop is considered a companion plant.
Great. And like I know that your PhD background is was in a really specific kind of companion planting. Do you want to start talking about that or
Sure. Yes, so my PhD research was specifically looking at living mulches, which is when you place the companion plant between your crop rows. And it's typically a non-crop plant, so it's not the idea of alternating plantings of, say, two different vegetables. It's, for my research, I was looking at sweet corn with strips of red clover growing between the rows of sweet corn, with the idea that increasing the overall diversity would provide a number of different benefits to the cropping system. So part of my research was looking at weed suppression, because you can get some insect focused benefits to companion planting as well. And then the other part of my research was looking at how does having this flowering plant between the crop rows affect the insect natural enemy community? What kind of pollinators are we supporting? And is that different than the bees that you might just find feeding on sweet corn pollen? And then does that potentially greater abundance of natural enemies have any effect on the pest pressure in the sweet corn?
so can you compare and contrast that to like what people might think of when they're thinking about like other organic mulches? Like I know no-till is something like a killed no-till. Is it similar?
Right. So a living mulch is essentially a cover crop that you keep alive throughout the growing season. So you can sort of establish that system different ways. So some people might plant their whole field into a cover crop and then just strip till out where they're going to put their primary crop that they're growing and then leave that cover crop between the rows. For my research, we kind of did the opposite and planted the red clover only in the strips where we were going to want it growing, and then came in and planted the sweet corn after, kind of in those bare areas between the living mulch.
Okay. I think that that practice might be kind of attractive to a kind of grower who, especially since like the vegetable growers I'm seeing in New Hampshire who are adopting no-till approaches, they're not doing no-till, they're doing partial. They're doing usually some kind of strip tillage. So I actually think this living mulch is less of a radical idea than I thought it might be.
So cutting out tillage was sort of one of the goals behind the study design. So the broader study looked at, I had red clover between strips of sweet corn, but then I also had a system where we planted the strips of red clover, and then in those areas where the sweet corn would grow, we either planted strips of tillage radish or strips of rye. And so the idea was then we came back in the spring, the tillage radish died, so we just had bare ground without having to till. And then in the rye, we rolled it so we would have that surface mulch.
Oh, cool.
And kind of looked at how that affected both insects, kind of ground predators, and weed suppression.
Okay. So, what did you find? Did it?
It worked very well for weed suppression. So we really didn't see a significant difference in weed biomass or yield reduction or anything like that between any of our systems. So we also compared this to a bare ground and just a full area of terminated cover crop residue. As far as the insects, it was a little bit more complicated because these were sort of smaller plot trials. So I think that we didn't see as many differences as I would have liked from the bare ground system in terms of ground predators and what we really expected that to influence. But we also had, plot borders that were just natural vegetation. And so it didn't take much for those ground predators just move into our relatively small plots.
I mean, that is the nature of small plot trials. Like, had you had some pests that really were well controlled by ground predators, then maybe you would have seen. What kind of ground predators were you looking at?
So we were mostly looking at carabid beetles for as insect predators. My thought being that maybe when the earworms, though they've already done their damage at this point, drop out of the sweet corn ear, that they might get them before they go to pupate in the ground and reduce that next generation coming out. So we're mostly looking at carabid beetles as insect predators. And then we also looked at things like grasshoppers, other species of carabids, and I think one or two others that I can't think of as weed seed predators.
Oh, very cool. Well, it sounds like one question I wanted to ask you, like when you were deciding like where to plant your living mulches, like how far away from the main crop were you getting, and like did you think you made the right decision in your research?
So that was kind of I'm trying to think. We planted everything on all the cover crops on 6-inch row spacing, and we had 3 rows of rye or forage radish or tillage radish alternating with 2 rows of red clover, because the idea was then that when that rye or that tillage radish created our crop row, it would be at the typical 30-inch sweet corn rows.
Okay.
And then we centered it between that. And we'd done previous research in the lab looking at tighter spacing where the living mulch was closer to the sweet corn or whatever crop we were looking at. And we did see some competition and yield reduction because of that. So we were also trying to space that out a little bit more.
Okay, so
what
what would you recommend if somebody wanted to adopt a living mulch or decide to do kind of like a strip tillage approach, depending on what crop you were doing? So like for sweet corn, you have recommendations.
Right. I was going to say for sweet corn, it seemed to work fairly well. The setup that we had at kind of I don't think 6 inches is typical for cover crops. I think 7 inches maybe is the standard. But 6-inch worked very well for us, just so that we could still have those 30-inch rows, and forget what the distance between the seed and the living mulch was, but you could lay it out. For other crops, it's a lot of trial and error. So it's going to depend. Like red clover is somewhat competitive and it will spread a little bit, but a lot of people I've read studies, people have tried with white clover as a living mulch and that spreads a lot more. So you might need greater spacing because that's going to encroach more on your crop. Other flowering plant species that people may want to use as a living mulch might be more or less competitive. So this whole idea of companion planting is very trial and error and seeing what works with the specific crop that you have, the specific living mulch or companion plant that you're trying to use. Even things like your type of irrigation or the soil type or things like that are going to influence how competitive or not these different
So
setups are.
would it be fair at this point to say like living mulch is a varsity level practice at this point, but there's a lot of potential?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, definitely a lot of potential. There are people doing it very successfully, but we just don't know enough about how all these different factors come together to be
Mhm.
able to say this specific crop, this specific living mulch, you want this spacing, and here's exactly how you do it, and here are the benefits you're going to get.
So for
Um,
the folks that you've talked to who are adopting living mulches, like what is their rationale? Like what do they think they're getting out of it? Like what's their feedback?
they're primarily organic growers, maybe certified, maybe not, but really going with the idea that they want to try to reduce the amount of sprays that they have to do for
Mhm.
weeds or insects. And they're typically willing to accept some level of pest damage. They're willing to see some amount of weeds out in the field, right? Because this practice does have potential to reduce your pest pressure, whether that's insects or weeds. It's never going to be comparable to coming through with an insecticide. You're never going to, most likely wipe out your pest entirely. That's not really the goal. The goal is just to have kind of a more balanced system where you can keep that pest pressure at an acceptable level.
Right. So kind of maybe moving out of the plot, like the most adoptable practices when it comes to enhancing natural enemies, like insectary plantings, like what are your feelings on that?
Right. So I think the easiest sort of companion planting strategy for growers is to have an insectary planting area designated off to the side. Maybe that's right along the field edge. Maybe it's a little ways away, but not too far, of flowering perennial plants that you establish it. And then you don't really have to do much to manage it. Maybe mow it in the fall just to keep trees and things like that from popping up in there. And then that perennial planting, I also think, has a lot of advantages to infield living mulches and companion plants because it does provide a refuge and an area for the insect natural enemies and pollinators to overwinter and kind of build up their population rather than some of these interplanting strategies where the goal is really just to hope that you have the natural enemies in the landscape and attract them right into the field. So
Yeah.
I think that's probably the most adoptable.
I mean, thinking about that, like you're betting a lot on nature providing you with the natural enemies you need. Like, how do you approach that when you're teaching your growers about companion planting? Like, do you teach them like the major players? Do you say, well, good luck, I hope you have the like? How do you approach that when people say, great, like I want to do insectary plantings, how much do I plant?
Generally, so I have not yet ever like gone out to a grower farm and tried who does no companion planting and said, let's set all this up. Let's find a system that works for you. In general, I will kind of briefly go through these are the different generalist predators that we have. They tend to feed on a variety of small, soft bodied pests, and I'll kind of rattle off aphids, thrips, white flies, things like that. Um,
And your usual suspects are probably like the bugs that people know, like lady beetles. What else? What else
right.
are like the ones that people go, oh yeah, I know that one.
Right. So lady beetles, they always tend to know. They've typically seen or have experienced the minute pirate bugs, but
Oh,
maybe haven't didn't know what they were called.
yeah.
But lady beetles rarely have many people seen the big-eyed bugs just because they scurry around so fast and kind of get
Mhm.
away from you. I'm trying to think. They've all seen signs of parasitism.
Yeah.
So of
Mummies.
course, yeah, the aphid mummies, the hornworms with the white pupa
That's
cases on the
that's
outside.
gnarly.
Um, lady beetles are by far the most recognizable of the effective
Right. Yeah,
enemies.
and I might edit in pictures of these with like a content warning of like some gnarly stuff.
It's a good idea.
So I know that you have been working with vegetable growers. I know that you just came from a meeting of really, really fun growers to work with. Like, what are your recommendations for those growers? Like you said, you haven't necessarily come in and peer pressured anybody to do it, but when it comes to this,
Right.
is it worth it? When is it worth it? Like, what's your best advice?
So I am of the opinion that, and I will tell growers, so I'm never going to discourage somebody if they want to start adding in these companion plantings and things like that. But I will typically have sort of a brief conversation with them to consider what their overall farm looks like, and outside of where they're farming, what sort of the landscape around them looks like, for a number of different reasons. So I am of the opinion that if they have a very diversified, fairly small operation, so they have several rows of one crop and then you move over a little bit and it's several rows of another crop, they probably already have a very diverse system. And if they're not, on an extremely intense spray schedule, they may not see this huge advantage to adding in a few rows of flowering plant resources for these natural enemies because there's already such a diversity of plants out there, of alternative pests. I'm sure those crops are flowering at different times. But those growers that maybe they're plopped right in the middle of, a agronomic field, or their neighbors are all doing corn, soybeans, wheat, and that's about it, or in an urban area too, they may see more of a benefit of adding in these companion plants, but it also may take some time because they don't have that reservoir of natural enemies in the surrounding landscapes to move right in once they plant those attractive plants. So it's another one of those things that there's no clear cut, if your landscape looks like this, or if you're surrounded by this type of, diversity, you should have a flowering annual companion plant versus a perennial insectary planting on the edge of your property.
Right.
It's another one of those trial and error.
I mean, that's cool. That I can definitely see you in Maryland. Like you would have so many of all those different types of such
Right.
situations, like that really diversified natural area, urban areas, like super monoculture areas. Like you're lucky in Maryland that you have such a diversity of growers to work with.
Right. It is very fun. We do have a lot of very different types of operations. Then we have a whole nother subset of growers kind of out in Western Maryland that do vegetable production almost exclusively in high tunnels because their
Right.
season's too short out there. And they're surrounded by forest and cows.
And they have like all like a completely different set of issues. Well, actually, that kind of leads into my next like genre of questions, which is, what kind of research do you want to see before you start recommending crazy things? Either research that you're planning, or you're hearing people like, or you wish people would do in order to help you make more decisions about this area.
So I would love to see more research results kind of looking at the relationship between specific plants that people use or recommend as companion plants, and what natural enemies or parasitoids, generalist predators, they're most associated with. Because, so there's a lot of general recommendations out there to just increase the overall level of flowering plants and you will have better biological control. But what we found in a lot of our studies and what a lot of other people have seen too is that when you sample the natural enemies in these various flowering companion plants, you do see a very high population or abundance of different natural enemies. But a lot of the time, and the flowering species seems to be different every time, they don't move out of the flowering species into the crop. So I think having a better understanding first of if some are more attractive to whatever natural enemy you might be trying to bring in would be really
Yeah.
useful. And then also trying to get a better understanding of like maybe some of these are too attractive and they're not. They're acting more as like a sink and they're drawing the natural enemies that might be in the crop into these flowering areas and not
Oh, that's such a good
staying in the
point.
crop where you want them to be. So we've seen that
Another,
in several of our studies.
See, another thing that it reminds me of is a conversation I had with a student who was kind of pursuing a similar question that you were, but he was looking at forage crops and saying, like, if we harvest them differently, like, what is the added potential? And we brought out an old Doug Tallamy paper that said, I forget what the number was off the top of my head. I have to look it up now, but it was like some huge portion of insect taxa that were flagged as natural enemies or beneficial had like a really intrinsic link to their plant families, right? And it really made me realize how laser focused we as IPM specialists are on a handful of like the really showy generalist predators. Like it's so easy to study lady beetles, like lacewings, orioles, things like that, without thinking of like the like huge cast of characters that could be providing ecosystem services, but we can't count in a way that is like reasonable, I guess. Like, would you? I don't even know how you would go about that, though.
I'm not sure how you
I
would.
th- I think that your question is much better. Is to say like you might be supporting the really important taxa, but are they staying there? At what point are they leaving to go and do the service that you want it to do? Like that's really interesting.
Do an assessment of just these different, because there are, I mean, you could in theory use anything that you want as a
Hmm.
companion plant, but there are kind of a handful of plants that for whatever reason have become popular to for people to use as companion plants over other things. So even just looking at the ones that I don't want to say they're recommended, but they almost seem like they've gained this reputation of being recommended companion plants, something
So
like
those,
marigold.
oh, marigold. Well, I here this might be another project where I get, a bunch of alumna of the Hooks lab together to duke it out about marigold. I don't know how well that would go. That might be like a private session over a couple of beers. But what what makes those really popular species recommended? Is it based on like people just like to grow them because they look nice, they're easier to grow, or is it because they're actually attracting a lot of natural enemies?
So I think in a lot of cases they are easy to grow. They do tend to be attractive to the different natural enemies, whether that means they actually help bolster the population and improve pest control is another question. But I think they also, at some point in time, a study was done and they were found to be very effective for one specific pest and system, and it just kind of expanded and they started people started attributing just general pest suppression to these different plants when really they've only been found to actually be effective for one thing. So marigolds have been shown to have some efficacy when it comes to, I think it's repelling certain types of plant parasitic nematodes in the soil. And then I think they just kind of gained this pest repelling reputation and that expanded to
I
other
feel like
pests. But
there has to be some kind of like folk history study of this because like there are very few gardens I go by that do not have marigolds in them around here. And it's always like, oh, so and so told me, or like it's usually like grandparents, like how long must it, because the thing is like when I grew up and found out like this was mostly about root knot nematode, I was like, how long have we been having problems with
you
root
don't
knot
even hear about
nematode?
that one in people's
Right.
garden considerations. Yeah.
Oh, I need to look into that to find out like the history of all that. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
But still like marigolds they still attract stuff, but like they attract other
Oh, they
stuff
do.
too, right? Like what do you feel free to say no. Do you want to weigh in on whether or not marigolds are more problem I know it's a controversial topic.
So I don't know. So I would say in most cases there's no harm in planting them. So marigolds are very attractive to thrips. But I've also really never heard of a case where people like have greater thrips problems because they are adding marigolds into their gardens.
Right.
I don't know if that's thrips are very hard to see, so it may just be going undetected too.
I think that's
Um,
a really important point because I'm also kind of struggling at any instances where commercial outdoor production in vegetables had a really bad thrips problem unless they were being really irresponsible with pesticides, unless they were growing in a tunnel. Like, can you think of another circumstance where thrips are really an economic problem?
so we have a lot of growers here. I know there are a lot of growers in like southern Jersey area that have a lot of thrips problems in their tomatoes, like field tomatoes. But they are not exclusively, but largely conventional operations. I think there is some amount of over not necessarily overspray, but some effect of spraying and kind of knocking out both the natural enemies and also knocking out the easier to control thrips species. And so then you end up selecting more for the western flower thrips, and then you have a harder time as the season goes on because that specific pest is more difficult to manage.
Because it probably does have a chemical resistance. It's one of those things where
Yeah,
like you probably should measure it, but chances are pretty good if you have Western flower thrips, it's going to have some kind of chemical problem, right?
right.
Thinking about your programming going forward, like when you're talking to your commercial growers who have really robust spray programs, like is incorporating companion planting part of that plan? Like, do you talk to those people about a potential for like insecticide? Or is it like is is there enough support for that from the research?
So in terms of like growers that I tend to talk to more about this type of stuff, and kind of see the potential in them adopting maybe some companion planting and things like that. It's currently more just the organic producers, and actually a lot of the urban farmers are very interested in all of this this type of companion planting work. The larger, more like large scale commercial operations in Maryland, they are very interested in other types of IPM practices. I think if we sort of ironed out more of the details with the companion planting and what maybe they could expect to see and what cropping systems it fits best in and that sort of thing, they would be interested and open to trying it. So they're always interested in anything to cut down the amount of times they have to spray, any effective product that's going to be less harmful on natural enemies or more pollinator friendly, that sort of thing. But they're also less likely, I think, to want to not experiment. They're very willing to experiment with things, but experiment with just adding in like they'd be hesitant, I think, to plant a some type of flowering living mulch between the rows because they have a very ironed out system of how they do things, and changing that really disrupts. I mean, it can complicate your spray program if you have big equipment, it's spraying over the whole field or multiple rows, and what you're spraying isn't labeled then for this thing that you decided to plant between the rows that you're now also spraying. So it definitely, I think, at the moment fits a little bit more easily with the smaller operations.
That makes sense to me. Yeah. Well, what's something that you wish people knew? Like, what did I not ask you that you think people should know about this stuff?
Didn't you ask me?
Or like, what's like the most common misconception whenever people come up
So,
to you after a talk?
absolutely, the most common misconception is the idea that companion planting is only successful if it fully reduces your pest damage comparable to insecticides. Like the idea that and maybe I'm not doing as good of a job of making it clear in my talk, but it seems as though people who have tried it and then they still see that pest out there to some degree, they deem it a failure. And I think it's this idea that it's not supposed to 100% control your pest. It's just supposed to sort of create a more balanced system, maybe reduce the number of times that you have to spray because you do have some level of pest control, by the natural enemies. There's some quote, I'm going to get it wrong. I'm not even going to try to quote it, but it's essentially this idea that like you really don't know what these natural enemies are doing for you until you knock them out, and then you see this explosion of pests. And
All right, well, I'll leave it there. Something we touched on briefly, but Veronica shared with me later, was a study they had done with a cover cropping system versus bare ground for sweet corn, looking at all the insects and the biosystem services that could be provided. And she brought up the concept of these carabid beetles eating weed seed. It's something I don't really think about when I think about biosystem services, but just another way that cover crops are a really helpful tool for people who are looking for weed control alternatives. So big thanks to Dr. Yurchak, and thanks for listening.